All right, let's talk about augmentative and alternative communication devices, also known as AAC devices. I guarantee you, now that you know the acronym AAC, you will almost never say augmentative and alternative communication. That's such a long name. So that's probably why they shortened it to AAC. Okay, let's let's talk about it. You know, first I'll just tell you this picture has nothing to do with AAC devices. Okay, moving on. So this is what we're going to go through for this lecture. We're going to talk about what AAC devices are first. I think probably a lot of you have at least somewhat of an idea of what AAC devices are, and even if you think you don't, I bet you actually do have some knowledge of some AAC devices. You might just not think of them as AAC devices. We'll talk about also the history, a little bit of the history of AAC devices, different types of AAC devices, and current usage, also best practices. I should say that there too. This is one type of AAC device. We'll talk about it more. This is kind of a high tech, um, modern version of a communication board. This is an iPad. It might not be exactly an iPad, but you can see it's some sort of touchscreen tablet that this child's using to be able to communicate by touching pictures. And likely, what would happen is this communication board would probably say the sentence that they're typing out to a communication partner, or the communication partner could read it if they can't hear what the communication board would be saying. Okay, so what are AAC devices? AAC devices. Well, we're going to start what are AAC devices by going back to a statement from ASHA in 1991. Communication is the essence of life. This encapsulates a lot of meaning into one short little sentence. But essentially, what this is saying is that communication is an absolutely essential part of being a living being, basically, right? And if you think about it, that's true. Um, it goes, I mean, if we can think about it beyond humans, which we did in the very beginning of this class, we talk about communication with bees, with dogs, other animals. Communication really is everywhere, also between non living things, even. So it is true that all living things need to be able to communicate. And going further on that, it is essential for someone who is trying to help people who have communication um, delays, communication differences, things like that, be able to communicate with other people, to understand the issues that they have, and then use technology. That's a very broad definition of technology. I don't necessarily mean like, tech devices, like give everybody a smartphone. I mean technology like how writing systems and sign language can be considered technology, maybe inventions or practices. But to come up with practices, technology, and things like that to address the individual needs of a person and allow them to communicate with, uh, hopefully, everyone. So then going a little bit narrower, an AAC device is basically just any device or technique used to communicate that isn't speech. Um, so the definition from ASHA for this is a device to compensate for temporary or permanent impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions of persons with severe disorders of speech language production and or comprehension. That's a mouthful. Basically, any device or technique that you can use to communicate that isn't speech. So why? I mean, I think that's kind of an obvious question. I mean, the answer the answer to that question should be obvious to you. Why is this important? Well, because it's necessary for social interaction. You know, basically, when you're isolated, that's not really a great way to live. I recently had, well, depending on when you're watching this video, um, had coronavirus, and I was able to not give it to anyone um, that I know. So I went and just kind of isolated myself. I lived in a tiny room for like 2 weeks. I didn't talk to anybody. It was really weird. So, you know, and I still had things like the internet. There was a little bit of talking. So it is necessary for social interaction. I'm sure a lot of you have gone through that as well. So you know that being isolated, even for a very temporary amount of time, is detrimental to your happiness, mental health, etc. So imagine something longer than 2 weeks. Also, to get things, food, um, money that you might even have in the bank, but to get it out to buy things, if for some reason, or to get a replacement credit card. Um, to tell others important information like that you are in pain or that there is an emergency that they need to attend to. So all of these are important. All of them are important in different ways. And of course, emergencies are less common than just typical social interaction. So there's different weightings on them, but they're all still important. So who uses an AAC? Well, like we say here, it's, you know, it can be temporary or permanent impairments that necessitate the use of an AAC. You can have somebody who's gone through surgery, a person with completely typical communicative abilities like me, and you go through surgery, and if it's surgery, say, on there's a type of sleep apnea surgery that detaches the tongue temporarily and then reattaches it. And that can make speaking extremely painful for, I don't know, I think usually about 4 to 6 weeks. Um, there's other, there are other, you know, we could go through a whole list of things that can affect um, people who don't have long term issues. But even then, having some way to communicate is necessary. And you could do pen and paper, and that works fine. It's a little slow, but that's okay. You could do a smartphone kind of thing where you text your what you want to say to somebody else, or even just write it on your phone and show it to them. But those are types of AAC devices. People with motor impairments, dysarthria, so things like multiple sclerosis, um, cerebral palsy, right? So you've got some motor issues. They can affect the speech apparatus. It can also affect other motor behaviors. So if you're just going to like text something out on your phone, that might not be as easy. So we have to come up with other methods of communication, ways to get the message out for people like that. Also, apraxia, different types of speech impairments, right? So aphasia, we know that with certain types of aphasia, Broca's aphasia, you have the word knowledge, but the word knowledge doesn't necessarily, it can't make the connection to be turned into the words that you're looking for, depending on how bad the Broca's aphasia is, to actually make it out to communicate an idea. So something like a communication board where the ideas are already there, you can point to them and convey your information that way. People with autism, especially the more severe spectrum of autism, benefit from AAC devices quite a bit. Other types of TBI that aren't necessarily under the aphasia umbrella, all of these can use an AAC device. I think one of the big things I should put on here that I don't have on here is just stressing again that it doesn't have to be a long-term issue that necessitates use of the device. It can be a short-term issue or medium. So there's all sorts of reasons why you might use an AAC device. What are the different types of communication that we can do with AAC devices? Well, sorry, I felt like I had a sneeze coming. Okay, we're good. There was a little bit of a sneeze, but it wasn't happening. We're good. So we can break this into conventional and unconventional. So conventional is going to use words, gestures, signs, symbols, all these different things that the general population would understand. I know that most of us who, I mean, let's be really, we're gonna generalize heavily here, but let's just go with the English-speaking Americans. Most of us don't know sign language. Sign language does go here, though, because there are a lot of people who do speak sign language. So the general communicative population, like you may be in a situation if you're using sign language where you are with other people who do know sign language. And so it's conventional, right? This is, if you're saying that sign language isn't conventional just because the majority of us don't speak sign language, that's also like saying, oh, Spanish is an unconventional form of communication because, I don't know, 75% of the United States doesn't know how to speak Spanish. So that's just a number I pulled out of the top of my head, by the way. I'm not sure if that's accurate. So obviously that's not true. Both of those are conventional forms of communication. With the right communicative group, you can communicate just fine. Writing, pictorial communication, things like that, with the right group who already knows these are conventional forms of communication. So, like we mentioned here, sign language is one form of communication. And so this is when I get to talk a little bit about history. So the earliest known form of sign language is plain sign language. I say the earliest known form because being a signed language, there's not likely to be much documentation of its use, So like we have I'm not even sure. We have carvings. Is it carving? Would you say it's carvings of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics? We have this somewhere near the Middle East, Cradle of Civilization area, named Göbekli Tepe. Oh, it's in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe. I have no idea how to say it. But it's about 10. It's like 10,000 years old, and there are carvings that could be pictograms. It could be an early language. It also could just be carvings of shapes and animals. But my point is, if there was a sign language to go along with that writing system, there's not a good likelihood that it was documented because it's a sign language. There's no need to put it somewhere because it's not necessarily a written language. So the earliest known sign language is plain sign language. It doesn't mean it was necessarily the earliest sign language, but it definitely predates the ones that we currently use. Certainly in North America, it predates American Sign Language by some estimates are like 1,000 years, and we know for sure, absolutely documented, that it predates American Sign Language by about 300 years. Though, for it to be so widespread and well used, you would expect that it would be a decent bit older than just the documented evidence that we have. But Point is, this language um, is spread throughout, or was spread throughout the plains of North America. I don't mean just the United States. I mean Mexico, United States, Canada. Of course, this was before there were those country boundaries, but this was spread across this entire continent, most of this entire continent. Um, what's interesting about that is there's about 37 different spoken languages in the same area, and these are not all of these are languages that are dialects of one another. Some of them are like completely different language systems, different language families. So these tribes couldn't necessarily communicate with each other verbally um, or written, with written language, because they had different verbal and written languages, but they all used the same sign language. One of the reasons, possibly, why, I mean, we never know exact histories for all these things, but a likely reason for the widespread uses of plain sign language is trade. So let's take a look at this map really quickly. So this is North America, pre-European colonization, and the spread of different Native American languages. Like a ton, right? There's a whole bunch of different ones. Some of them are close to being dialects of others, but there are at least four different distinct languages here that you would not be able to even start to approximate what someone else was saying. That's at least four different ones, possibly more than that. This is plain sign language. This is where plain sign language was used. Pretty much everywhere. There's a couple offshoots of different types of sign language that were used heavily in these areas. Now, this isn't just for members of these native groups who happen to be deaf or hard of hearing. This was used by it was used by deaf members of these Native American groups, but it was also used by people who would do like statesmanship and stuff like that, to declare war or to avoid war, to trade, to do all sorts of this stuff. I mean, if you ever go to any museum, of a Native American civilization, at least here in Arizona, one of the things that they'll show you is there are shells that have to come from over here in the northeast, the northeast coast of North America, because it's the only place that the animals that come out of these shells live, which means that these shells were traded over this entire area to get down to here in Arizona. There's a lot of stuff over from California, and we know that it wasn't like a day-to-day thing that these groups who lived here in Arizona were like, oh, we're just going to go over to California today and bring back a bunch of stuff. No, that's not the way it was. It was an extensive trading network. And also, sometimes different groups would band together for hunting parties. They couldn't really talk to each other with their languages, with their spoken languages, because they were different. So they used plain sign language. Another benefit from that is that it's quiet. So if they are doing like a hunting party type thing, they're not scaring off what they're hunting. And also, it involves a lot of motions, which is one similarity that it shares with American Sign Language. There's a lot of motions with American Sign Language. Not when you're, spelling things out, except for some of the letters. But there's a lot of motions associated with different things. So you could see these at a distance. You didn't have to necessarily be right next to someone. So you could actually have a pretty extended form of communication, almost like, texting. So pretty pretty cool. The documented evidence that we have is from the 1500s, early 1500s of this language, but it was already that widespread by then, which is why some linguists think that it's, probably from the around 1000 AD times. So why am I talking about this as an AAC device? Well, first of all, because, like I said, deaf members of these Native American groups did use it to communicate with each other and the rest of their tribe and other tribes, etc. But also, when French and Americans did come over to the continent, you can see that it's up here in like New England area, New Canada, Labrador type area too. Not New Canada, New France. And so there's some evidence that trappers, early settlers, and people like that ended up using plain sign language to communicate themselves. The fur trappers learned it for hunting and communication for trade, and then it was passed to settlers for communication for trade, but then also for deaf members of those settler groups as well. So they used that until French Sign Language and American Sign Language became a little bit more widespread in the early to mid 1800s. So it was a really influential and useful sign language. Again, one of the earliest known ones. Unfortunately, there are not many people who know how to speak this anymore. So that's like an absolute bummer. Okay, so that was a form of conventional communication. What about an unconventional? What are unconventional forms of AAC or communication? Well, these are words or gestures, signs, symbols that are recognized only by people who have shared experience with the communicator or the communicative device. So one of these is a familiar listener effect. So there are different kinds of like vocalizations that aren't necessarily words. They're just vocalizations that the parent or a caregiver of a person will recognize as I need to get your attention right now versus, oh, I like this. You see that with parents of really young children. Sometimes they know what different sounds mean, whereas they can kind of differentiate different cries and have an idea of what the child wants just from the crying. And the rest of us are just like, whoa, make that noise stop. And then also the E-Tran board, which is what we're looking at here. So this is called an E-Tran board. And essentially, how does the E-Tran board work? Well, first of all, E-Tran stands for eye transfer. And they, I think, just called it E-Tran because it sounds cool. But anyway, the way that you use this would be for someone who mostly has just control over eye movements. The way that you're decoding what they're looking at or what they're communicating to you is by watching where the eye movements go. So you can see that there are handles here and here. Those are for the person who is communicating with the person who needs help to hold this up in front of them. They look at their face through here, so the two of them can make eye contact through this little window right here. And also the person who's communicating with the person who has the deficit is going to look through here at that person's eyes as they look at these different areas. So our view is of the person with the communication deficit. Though it's likely that this is going to be replicated on the other side for the person who is the communication partner. Okay, so there's two things that you have to do. The first thing that you do is designate which group of letters and numbers you're looking at. So let's say we want to, I've got a code here. F1 is hamburger, F2 is pizza. The F stands for food, of course. And then we've also got people, possible caregivers for this person. G1 is Grandma Jones and G2 is Grandma Garcia. So if we want to communicate hamburger, we have to designate a group of things that we're looking at, and then we have to designate which in that group we're looking at. So F1 is what we want to signify for hamburger. Okay. Notice that let's look at the upper left. We've got ABC 1 2 3. I want to play like a 2 seconds of that Jackson 5 song, but I'll probably get hit with a copyright thing on YouTube, so just imagine it. Anyway, the A is red, the B is black, the C is blue, the 1 is green, the 2 is orange, the 3 is pink. Okay, look at the color of the border for each of these different groups. The one on the upper left is red, the one in the middle, upper middle is black, upper right is blue, lower left is green, lower middle is orange, lower right is pink. Almost got confused with my right and left there. So the color corresponds to what's inside the box. Okay. Got that? There, we've got like a color. We're matching up colors. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do for F1 is, I guess I need to get a little bit closer. Also, when I lean back, you can't hear me as well. Okay. I'm going to look directly at the camera. And so to show you which group of letters I want to look at first, I'm going to go like that. Where am I looking? Upper middle. So that narrows it down to 6 items that I could be looking at. So we know upper middle, so what I'm communicating to you is something DEF 456. Cool? Okay, so now within there, it's really difficult if I was just going to look at either the D, the E, or the F for you to figure it out, because I'm looking within this tiny little window, and, you know, the difference between D and F is small. So what we do is, now we look at the one that corresponds to the color, because you already know that I'm looking in the upper middle. So now I'm going to go like that. So I'm looking at the upper right. So that's told you I'm looking in upper middle, and then within the upper middle, I'm looking upper right. So that's F. Okay. So now for 1, I'm going to go like this. Upper left. And then, you know, I'm looking at ABC 1 2 3, and then to narrow it down from there, I go like that. Lower left. So now you know it's 1. Okay, so I'm going to communicate to you one of these 2 grandmas, and you have to figure out which one it is. Okay. Okay, so which one was that? That's how an E-Tran board works. All right. Oh yeah, hit the arrow. You'd think I'd know how to advance a slide by now. Okay, so we also have a continuum of communication. Not everybody's in the same place. A dependent communicator requires a lot of help from the communication partner. So this would be somebody who can only communicate really with screams or movements. They really need a lot of work from their communication partner. It has to be somebody who knows what they're talking about. It has to be somebody who can, who's paying close attention to what the person is saying, so it's heavily dependent. Supported, a little bit of help is necessary. So eye gaze or communication board for someone with broca's of, well, so let me go back. I'm saying eye gaze, but an E-Tran board would be extremely dependent. They absolutely need someone to help them with that communication because they're looking, but there has to be another person who's really attentive and supporting that communication to like understand what they're saying. Okay, but then we go to supported, and when I say eye gaze here, I mean like Stephen Hawking up here in the upper right corner. So I have him in the independent communication, which is true. We're going to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that he's using is an eye gaze. It's an eye gaze device, but essentially it's an eye tracker, and it can see where you're looking. It's better than your communication partner with an E-Tran board because it can detect really small variations, so it can see exactly what letter on the screen I'm looking at right now, which is hard for just regular people, but of course the computer can do it. So they have these for communication boards, which just have the pictures on them, and those can be set up with eye tracking. So you can use that with eye gaze, or you can use a typical communication board, which would be just kind of a cardboard or plastic thing that you hold up and point to different icons that communicate different ideas. So maybe somebody with Broca's aphasia would use that to communicate what they want to eat for lunch, for instance. So they are not completely dependent on someone else to do most of the communication, but they are supported. They do need to have someone to at least, show the thing to and say I want, they're, showing a hot dog. They need this. So you can see it's less dependent. It's not as much work and attention from a communication partner, but there's some, it's considered supported. And then we've also got independent communicators. And here is where Stephen Hawking fit in before he died, because his communication board, his eye gaze device was essentially like a computer keyboard. And he could look at different letters and essentially type out an entire message. And that's what he did for his lectures and talks that he would give, TED Talks, lectures, all sorts of stuff like that. Type them in ahead of time and then just kind of look at a thing and they would play. So he's a completely independent communicator. He can basically type out something that he wants to say and then say it without really any work from someone else. No more work than regular, I don't want to say typical communication. All right, so here's our best practices. We want to take steps to have someone use an AAC device. So what you want to do is first you want to figure out where does this person lie on a continuum of communication skills. So what kind of communication skills do they have? Are they going to need are they going to be heavily dependent on a communication partner, supported or independent based on what they've already got, their communication skills? Then look at their communication needs. What is their daily life? What do they need to communicate? So we're talking about a pretty young child. There's a much smaller group of needs that they would need to communicate versus somebody like Stephen Hawking, who's communicating the fabric of the universe is made of this. Also, I'd like a sandwich. So there's a big difference between these different communication needs. This could also be like someone who is on disability and doesn't work, so they mostly communicate with their family, or someone who still is working and would need to have some on-the-job types of communication. what restrictions they have, like language level or motor problems. This kind of overlaps with identifying where they are on the continuum. What are the strategies they're going to use now and also later? So, is this a disease that's going to progress? Is the child going to develop? Are they expected to cognitively develop? Or are they just going to grow physically, but not necessarily cognitively? So, like, let's say this is a person with a speech only issue, cognition is intact. They're going to have an increasing amount of things they need to say. So they start off with a small communication board. Eventually, we're going to be moving up to a much more complex communication board until you get to a point where the communication board is just hindering the amount of communication that they'd like to be doing. You might have to move to something like the eye gaze device like Stephen Hawking has possibly. If, however, we're talking about somebody with a degenerative disease, multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, something like that, right now, maybe they can use a communication board of their own that they can tap on. But that's not sustainable. So you need to be planning ahead for the future. So buttons that can get further apart. So a touchscreen would be better. You can have smaller buttons now, larger buttons as the disease progresses, to the point of using different kinds of input devices that we'll talk about in a second, but essentially switches or buttons that are on the outside of the device. Then you'll come up with an intervention plan. What kind of AAC they'd like. Here's how we're going to start you on this. You're going to start using it. And then you're going to measure the outcomes. You're always collecting data. How are they progressing? Are they happier? Do they feel like they're communicating better? Does the family feel like they're being more effective at communication? So that's the kind of outcomes that you want to take into account. This is just kind of here mostly for your notes. Like we've kind of gone over this. It's just not really a graph, just a table of different types of communication options that exist for all these different constraints. So you can have different vocal types of communication. So if they're able to, use their voice or not, you've got verbal unaided would be speech, just what we're doing now. Non-vocal, verbal unaided is sign language. Then you've got verbal aided. So it's verbal, it's still using, words, and it's vocal, it's a speech generating device. So like a communication board that has a voice and it would talk. Non-vocal, you could just use written language or pointing to a communication board. Non-verbal, laughing or crying, and because it's vocal. Non-verbal, but it is vocal. And then non-verbal and non-vocal is like pointing or just expressions. So there's a whole kind of continuum here. Not the, well, yeah, this fits in with our continuum of communication. So again, that's mostly just for your notes. Here are two different types of communication boards. The bottom one is one that you can buy. It's marketed by a company. There's a few different pages that can go along with this communication board. And essentially you point to all these to be able to communicate with a person. Now this particular one is I think used for medical. Yeah, this is the one that's used for medical stuff, going to the doctor, going to the hospital for somebody who needs a communication board. This is that thing that they always give you about what's your pain level. I hate these because you're never sure like what the calibration is. Like, is 10 I'm actually, like gonna die? Like, I don't know. And so then you tell them that your pain's a 6, and they're like, go home. Anyway, so again, this is one that you can actually buy, but you can make your own if there are money constraints or time constraints on, getting the communication board. Both of these, of course, are money constraints are perennial. There's always money constraints, right? Especially for people that need services, which is totally not right. But cool new thing that we're dealing with in the last 2 years is we just can't get stuff. Stuff exists and it can't get here. So, like global supply chain. I never wanted to know about it because it seemed boring. And now it is boring, but it's also aggravating. But anyway, you can make your own communication board by putting pictures of things that you printed off into, this is like a cookie sheet. Glue them in, tape them in, glue magnets to the back of them and just magnet them on to the cookie tin so you can like change them out and use the same tin for a different communication board. And it works. It works in a pinch. You can probably make it work totally long term. I am not going to play this YouTube video for you, but you do have these PowerPoints and you should watch the video. Basically, the video is just going to show you about a certain type of communication board. One thing that they're going to talk about is modeling the use of the communication board. And I want to just absolutely kind of underscore how important that is. It's important for adults model the use of the communication board. Yes, that's true. But adults can motivate themselves to communicate like this. Kids are a little bit worse at motivating themselves to do things. Any of you who have kids or siblings or were a child probably can agree with that. Like, there's all sorts of stupid choices I made that I should have encouraged myself to do differently, but I didn't because I was 5. So, one of the things that really does motivate kids is not just telling them that they should do something, but it's actually doing that thing with them, with others, so they can see it. And so when we're talking about communication boards, the parents can use a communication board to talk to each other or to a sibling. Friends can use the communication board too. So like if you use the communication board to talk to the kids' friends and then they can communicate using the communication board, that really helps scaffold the use of the communication board and model the use of the communication board. Kids always want to do what their siblings and their parents and their friends are doing, which is why when you curse in front of them and then tell them not to do it, they still do it. You've modeled it. And then you're like, hey, don't do this. And they're like, hey, I'd rather be like you than listen to you. So then they go to school and they say bad things. And then they have to go to the principal's office. And then they call their mom and they're like, your kid said this today. This is totally autobiographical of my life. Anyway, my mom doesn't even curse that much. I just thought it was fun, I suppose. So, modeling the communication board is really, 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 really important. We get a lot more compliance with using it when there's modeling. This is true for everything. So like good behaviors, I mean, you know, not to like go on like preaching about education here, but like good eating habits. The best way to teach children good eating habits is to like do them rather than just tell them. And this is true for communication boards too. So if you want to ingrain into a child to use them and you are the service provider, you have to get the parents on board to use them at home too. You have to stress that with them. Okay, high-tech AAC. Well, iPads or dedicated devices, um, you know, iPads are so much more. I don't. You know what? I don't like the Apple Corporation, so I'm not even going to say iPads anymore. Why do I not like Apple? They cost so much, and possibly exploitative labor practices, but I don't see that happening, so it doesn't really. But they're so like, hey, come here, pay $600 for an iPhone, or I could buy a piece of crap for $100, and I went that route. Use my other $500 on like expensive coffee. Anyway, tablets and other dedicated devices are so much cheaper now than they used to be, unless it's an Apple. It's still expensive. But you can get like all sorts of cheaper ones for a lot less. I've got one over there, but you know what a tablet looks like. I don't need to show you. And you can download apps that work as communication boards. You can put in exactly what icons you'd like to use. They have a bank of them, and you can like drag them into a communication board, save it as a different person or a different time of day. Most of those require some sort of subscription, but the subscription to the communication board apps are not nearly as expensive as some of the devices. There are dedicated devices which are made to be a lot more robust and protect against dropping. So if you have a younger person that needs a communication device, that might be a good idea. And of course, you don't have to pay a fee monthly for these dedicated devices. They are just more expensive up front, and then they have a communication board in them forever. So there's different levels of tech that way. But they're always getting cheaper, right? Like, I mean, the price of tablets have come down, 10 years ago when I started graduate school, I did not have a tablet. They were like way too expensive. I had the very first Kindle, like the really cheap one that was like black and white, and it only showed just books. I had that. And then, eventually they're like, hey, you can like play video games on these. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I need a different tablet. But anyway, the price of them has just really come down. And they probably will continue to come down. So they're getting a little bit more democratic and widespread in their use. There are also these types of things that you can push on. This is one that's worn on the wrist. You can pre-record a message on that. And so you can wear that to play a particularly important message. One of these YouTube videos that I have here is a person who has typed messages into their communication device and then uses them to communicate with people around town. The other one is an SLP who has taught their dog, Stella, to use these AAC devices to communicate, which is, I have a dog. It's very cool. Sometimes I feel like I'd like to know more about what he's thinking, and I wish he could talk, but I also know that if I taught him how to talk, he would just be like, food, 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 play, food. He really likes to eat. Anyway, one other thing to think about with high-tech AAC is you have a lot of icons. Well, this is actually something to consider with the communication boards as well. But do the icons make sense? If there's a little bit of a language barrier in receptive language, the icons have to make sense. This particular icon is one that I don't even understand, and I feel like I have good receptive language. So if you had this on, like, the communication board for a person with Broca's aphasia, what is this this doesn't make sense to me. So there's a big user experience problem with some of these as well, which is a good career path for somebody who is a speech language pathologist, to just see what are the best, most effective icons, what makes more sense intuitively. And this one in particular, I think, does not work. What is that saying? Who is this person? I have a question. I am the Riddler. I don't know. I don't get it. Okay, so we've got a couple different kinds of ways to interact with these as well. You really have to watch these YouTube videos too. You know, if I'm teaching in person, I can just play them on the screen that comes down. But when you play a YouTube video on a YouTube video, YouTube gets really angry at that, and so I can't do it. So please, if you're watching this, go to on Canvas, get the PDF, click on this link, and watch these videos. They're really informative. So direct access is a type of access where the user can actually just, like, you know, directly click on a letter, an image, touch an image, or anything like that. So a communication board is direct access. You can point to any image. A computer keyboard, hey, it came in handy. Finally, this picture that didn't have anything to do with anything. This is direct access. Because those are keyboard keys, right? So anyway, direct access. All day long when I'm typing things out for research papers, I'm directly accessing data input array. This is all direct access. But then there's also indirect access. And this is really important for people who have motor issues. Indirect access, you don't have good enough motor coordination to, you know, point directly at little hard to get to things. They're not hard to get to if you don't have motor issues, but, you know, key on a keyboard, if you just have kind of gross motor issues and you can only get vaguely in a general area, that's going to be difficult for you to try to hit the correct key. So we have indirect access. There's a few different ways that we can do this, but there's clickers like on a game show, or even, you know, they're kind of like just a pen that you click. There are switches that you can put under the feet, so you can tap your foot, you can move your head or your shoulder into a switch and access that way. And what these are set up to do is what you're communicating on, which is a computer, tablet, something like that, is going to kind of scan across the input variables. So if it's a communication board, it'll light up half of the communication board and then the other half of the communication board. And what you do is, when that half is lit up, you click. And so then it goes, okay, we're going to communicate over here. And then it'll kind of cut it in half the other way, the top or the bottom. If you want to, you know, communicate it from the bottom, you click, then it'll go half and half again, and you just continue clicking until you get on the right thing. A keyboard can do that as well. The video that I have here walks you through a few different methods. You can have one where it just kind of goes across on every key, and you click when it gets to the right letter that you want. Different methods are faster to get to the correct thing, but none of them are particularly fast. But they allow for communication when you can't otherwise communicate. So they're absolutely necessary and helpful. Okay. That's direct and indirect access. Please take a look at those videos for sure. So this is our last slide. I just want to really quickly highlight some important things that we talked about. First of all, focus on real communication and the communicator, not the technology that you have. There might be technology that the person wants. There might be technology that they're afraid of, depending on their age. Or technology that is being pushed on you by parents or an organization that you work for. But what you need to do as the caregiver is focus on the service provider, not the caregiver, is focus on the real communication that they're going to be doing, what they actually want to communicate about, what they need to communicate about, and their lifestyle, not anything superficial. It's good to have multiple communication systems in case one fails. I habitually let my phone die. Like I don't know. It doesn't occur to me to charge my phone until it's on like 4% battery and I'm like on like at a conference in another state and I'm like, oh, I forgot to bring my phone charger. Well, I guess I have no way to get in contact with anyone if I need help. So it's good to have a backup in case you have someone like me who will forget to charge their tablet that helps them communicate with everyone. So have like a paper version of a communication board in their pocket or inside a little pouch with the electronic communication board so they can go to that in case there's, forget to charge it. Here's another thing. Some parents, family members, even some service providers think that AAC devices inhibit language development. No, not at all. This is not true. Giving someone a communication board, giving a child a communication board as they're developing their language does not hinder language development. It actually often, not 100% of the time, it doesn't hurt it ever, but it often supports it. Now, if you think about language, that totally makes sense. Language is what's going on up in the top. This is 205, so most of you probably haven't taken my 367 class yet, although some of you have. I know it doesn't have a prereq, so maybe some of you have. But language is what's going on up top. It doesn't directly have anything to do with the mechanism by which the message gets out. That's to say, speech and how good or bad at speech you are doesn't influence the message, the thinking, the putting together of language, the way of communication up in the brain where you're actually putting your language together. Talking with your hands, writing things out, using a communication board, it all scaffolds the actual development of language and the understanding of the ordering of phrases, complex ideas and things like that. That all still comes. You have to do that no matter how you're communicating. So language, of course, is like definitely not going to be hindered by the use of an AAC device. Now, speech is an output device, and again, some people think that speech is going to be hindered by an AAC device, but no, it is not. Again, most often, speech is supported by an AAC device. There's no evidence that it's hindered, and that's for the simple reason of it is so much faster to talk than it is to point at a thing. One of the other things is if you're worried about that, if the parents that you're working with are worried about that, other family members, if it's an older person that's using this, have them model pointing and communicating with the communication board so that communication can be facilitated, but also attempting to speak while they do it. And then it can be a tool to help speech development as well. But again, that's just a false idea that AAC devices are going to inhibit speech and language development. It just doesn't happen. Hey, generic and high frequency vocabulary is way more effective than, fringe words. Now, of course, most communication boards are going to be made so that they have generic and high frequency vocabulary. But what is generic and high frequency for each person is a little bit different for each client. So somebody who is still working but has a temporary issue where they can't speak needs a very different communication board than someone, a grandparent who mostly just hangs out with their grandkids. That's a completely different communication board. what's high frequency for the person who's still working is going to be probably terms that go along with their job. And what's high frequency for the person who's just hanging out with their grandkids is probably going to be ice cream and French toast. So definitely this goes along again with the very first point of like focus on the client. They're the one that you're trying to help, and let them be an active participant in the process of developing the AAC plan. It'll work better for them. You'll have more fun with it too, and you'll feel better when they're able to communicate more effectively. And then modeling. That's the last thing. Modeling. Most important thing you can do as a service provider is to teach the family and friends how to model use of a communication board or any other AAC device, so that the person that you want to get to use it does actually use it. Okay, that is the end of this slideshow, and I will see you soon. I never figure out where my mouse is. Okay.